Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, July 9th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. I'm sorry my white-bearded friend Ray is not here with us, but if he's watching, a big cheerio.
We still don't know if he's going to join us. He's in Germany, and he said that he's going to join us, but so far we don't know if he's going to come up with us. But let's get started, John, with what has happened, the latest events, the latest news on the conflict in Ukraine and the way that the United States, I would say Donald Trump, is trying to somehow change his rhetoric. Last week, he was talking about stop sending weapons to Ukraine. And yesterday and the day before, you see the tone's changing and everything's changing in Washington. It seems that he's going to send more weapons to Ukraine and he's going to put sanctions on Russia, both.
Yes.
And here is what he said in terms of weapons.
More weapons to Ukraine?
We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. They're getting hit very hard. We're going to have to send more weapons. Yeah, defensive weapons primarily, but they're getting hit very, very hard. So many people are dying in that mess.
So how in the world, by providing more weapons, you're going to kill less Ukrainians?
Well, I think you're right. It's very important to say what you've just said, Nima, and thank you for saying it. Trump is now showing what he's really like. And a lot of the talk that we've been considering, that he's sincere in trying to make peace, is exposed now by himself. And the rhetoric includes expletives. He now swears at President Putin. Following that clip of him speaking at the dinner with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I'll put it up on my Dances with Bears, the full clip, so that our audience can watch it. It's very important to watch what this man now says and the way in which Netanyahu goads him. You can also see in the background of the clip you just showed us the Secretary of Defense, Peter Hegseth, nodding his head. Now, there is a personality cult in Washington. You got on one side of Trump, Secretary of State Rubio, the other side on his left, Hegseth, and they nod. They nod in compliance with everything the president says. And further down the table, you have Trump's ambassador to Israel, Huckabee, piling on the compliments. He can't open his mouth, Trump, now, no matter what he says, without his men nodding their heads and agreeing. So you have a personality cult increasingly visible, and that's encouraging Trump not to be careful in the way he speaks of others, including the president of Russia, and of the way he speaks of the so-called enemy states, Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, and so on. He's no longer careful. He now uses expletives. And the big change is what we've been saying all along. And it's not comfortable to say. We've been saying it all along. This man is arguably the most violent, least personally controlled individual ever to sit in the Oval Office, to be president of the United States. And what he's doing now effectively changes Russia's approach. Now, we've been talking in the past about the Oreshnik moment, metaphorically and literally. That's the moment when President Putin has exhausted all of the diplomatic options he's put on the table. As we were talking about before, as you said yourself, Nima, the big Russian move has been to put 33 points of negotiation to end the war in the Ukraine and to end the war in Europe, basically, on the table in Istanbul. They matched the 22 points which Trump's emissary to the Ukraine, General Kellogg, worked out with the Ukrainian side, with the approval of the British, the French, and the Germans in London. So 33 points on the Russian side, facing 22 points on the Ukrainian side, the American side, the European side, represented what President Putin called last week two memorandums, which were completely opposite or opposed to one another. And Putin added, that's why we're in negotiation, to see how we can bring the two together. Putin's been completely consistent and stuck to that line. And in supporting that line, he said it himself, but he's also had Foreign Minister Lavrov say it, and he's had his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, keep saying it. We believe the President of the United States is, quotes, sincere. We appreciate his efforts to negotiate. Well, negotiations finished. Trump has just said it. There's no point in negotiating with Trump. He doesn't want it. His understanding of negotiation has now been revealed in the two words he's used. He used in the following that dinner with Netanyahu, he had a cabinet meeting. I don't know if you've got the clip there. I'll put it on Dances with Bears. But he says, essentially, and he uses the swear word bullshit. Putin throws a lot of bullshit at me. He's nice, but it's meaningless. Now, what's meaningless is Trump can't negotiate. He won't negotiate. He doesn't understand and doesn't accept negotiation. All he understands and accepts is what he keeps repeating he did to Iran: bomb them. He only understands, to use it in strategic jargon, escalation dominance, escalation control. And 2 points about that. For the Russian side, they now have to accept that the man, President Trump, is mad, cognitively mad. Why? His vanity has become overwhelming. You've heard him over the last few days endlessly repeat he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He repeated it in front of Netanyahu. Netanyahu presented him a letter nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize, although it's 6 months too late past the official date. But Trump has worked out the way to break the deadline too. So, and he's got the Norwegian Prime Minister on his side for that. So the vanity reflects something that's beyond control. And when he uses his mouth to use expletives in the direction of President Putin, he's insulting the president of Russia and refusing to negotiate. The second part of the madness is the belief that you can bomb your adversary into submission. And we've talked about that last time. His belief that the bombing of Iran obliterated is a word he keeps repeating. And this man's brain is only capable of repeating slogans. Obliterate was the term he kept repeating after the bombing of the 3 Iranian nuclear plants. And the words he keeps repeating since the telephone call with President Putin on July 3rd was, I'm very disappointed with Putin. He no longer calls him President Putin, he calls him Putin. I'm very disappointed. I'm very unhappy. I'm very disappointed. Trump doesn't say this once in a conversation. He says it 2 or 3 times in one conversation and then repeats it the next day. So we come closer to an acceptance on the Russian side that all the effort to get Trump to the negotiating table, all the optimism and goodwill that Trump brought when inaugurated, that he would be different from Biden, has now evaporated out of Trump's very vulgar and insulting mouth.
John, you've mentioned Donald Trump using that word to talk about Vladimir Putin. Here is what he said after calling Putin that way. He's talking about sanctions as well, John.
Yes.
Here is what he said, by the way, what you've mentioned.
War that was a war that should have never happened, and a lot of people are dying, and it should end. And I don't know, we get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin. For you want to know the truth, he's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Do you want to sanction him? Lindsey Graham has a sanctions bill on Russia. Do you want him to move?
I'm looking at it. Yeah, no, I'm looking. The Senate is passed a very, very tough sanctions bill. Yeah, I'm looking at it.
And you'd sign that?
It's an optional bill. It's totally at my option. They pass it totally at my option, and to terminate totally at my option. And I'm looking at it very strongly.
Yesterday you said you want to see.
Yeah, John, it doesn't seem that it doesn't matter who you're gonna get as the president of the United States. You always end up with Lindsey Graham and his mindset and his plans.
Well, there'll always be a Lindsey Graham in the United States Senate and several of them in the House of Representatives. What's interesting about the way in which Trump said that yesterday in the cabinet room is that he considers the Graham bill and the attempt to sanction everyone in the world for collaborating with Russia as a target of sanctions, or Iran as a target of sanctions, is that he considers the bill to be entirely at his discretion to implement. Now, the lure to the business community of Russia, the oligarch constituency around President Putin, the oligarch constituency that usually speaks through Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman, was that Trump considers that he has the discretion to suspend sanctions. It's very difficult, legally speaking, to pass through Congress the reversal or abandonment of sanctions. It took the Congress almost a generation to remove the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which had penalized the Soviet Union and traded the right of Jews to leave the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, early 80s, in exchange for favorable trade agreements with the Soviet Union. It took a long time. Instead, what happened was that Jackson-Vanik was suspended annually by the President of the United States. And that's essentially the executive discretion that Trump is saying legally. So he's saying, I will use it, I will think about it, I will hit them with the Stone Age sanctions that Graham's proposed. What he's leaving out is what the CNN report of the last few hours has to say about his mind. CNN has reported that it has tapes of Trump's election funding, election campaign appearances during the 2024 campaign. And I'll just read out what CNN is reporting that he said. And it's using the same expletive. So if there are children in the room, the parents don't want to hear these bad words uttered by the President of the United States in public, let's have the children leave the room. But the children can't leave the room if they're in charge of states. What Putin is reported to have said during the election campaign, one of the fundraisers, was, quotes, with Putin, I'm reading it now, with Putin, I said, if you go into Ukraine, I'm going to bomb the shit out of Moscow. I'm telling you, I have no choice, Trump said during one 2024 fundraiser, according to the audio. And then Trump goes on. And then Putin goes like, I don't believe you, but he believed me 10%. Now, that's what's called escalation dominance, escalation control. Trump thinks he must have it. His vanity, his sense of self, his sense of personal power, his sense of competence, everything he says in his brain, which he repeats over and over again. There's cognitive disability in these behaviors and these utterances, and the vulgarity confirms how violent he is personally. Now, when he says things like that, what he means is he's going to come up with something nasty, something that's been in planning for years, just as he said he did to Iran in June. Now, what's nasty? Yes, you're right. Sanctions are one, but Trump is too violent in his approach. Escalation dominance, escalation control, up towards the point of using nuclear weapons to, quote, bomb the shit out of Moscow. That's his style. That's his mentality. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, we got a taste of it on June 1, the attack on the nuclear triad bomber bases. Yes, it was conducted by Ukrainians using various Central Asian recruits to operate trucks and fire drones at each of the bases. Two of the bases were hit, the others failed. That's one form. Second, he can launch what is already going on and is relatively underreported. Russian chemical tankers, Russian oil tankers, and soon perhaps Russian gas tankers are being attacked wherever they're sailing. There've been attacks off Libya. There have been other attacks in the Mediterranean. There was an attack on a Russian tanker in Ust-Luga, the port near St. Petersburg, very recently. These are war acts against the Russian flagged vessels carrying cargoes. They're attempting to sabotage at sea and in port Russian trade. So before we get to the so-called Lindsey Graham sanctions you asked about, what the United States, what the British, what the German, and what the French are doing is attacking Russian shipping. And that's war. It's not terrorism. It's war using sabotage, using cut-out individuals far from the Ukrainian battlefield. This is war everywhere against Russia. That's bombing the shit, to use Trump's word. Children, stop up your ears. Wherever Russian trade can be found and wherever Russian trade can be vulnerable. That's what he's meaning, applying what he said in the campaign to what his options are now. And let me quote you the attempt by President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, to play it down. Yesterday, before Trump's latest expletives were known to the Kremlin, Peskov said, and I'm quoting from TASS and from Vedomosti yesterday, Peskov noted the Kremlin highly appreciates the efforts of the United States. President Donald Trump personally and members of his team have initiated direct negotiating process between Russia and Ukraine. Moscow believes there is very wide potential for restarting trade and economic relations between the two powers. That's what he said yesterday, insisting on behalf of the Russian oligarchs and formally on behalf of President Putin, they want to believe Trump is behaving nicely. He isn't. Today, after the CNN report came out, what did Peskov try to do? Quotes, I can neither confirm nor deny this with all my desire. According to the Kremlin representative, that's Peskov, there were no telephone conversations between Trump and Putin during the designated period, 2024. We are talking about a time when Trump was not yet president of the United States. Peskov stressed the Kremlin has no information about the authenticity of the recording and urged caution towards such reports. Quotes Peskov, "There are now many more fakes than truthful information." Now, why is he covering up? Putin may very well believe there were audio fakes. That's possible. But after Trump himself said what you showed him to be saying, there's no room in the Russian factional politics for insisting he didn't mean it. And as you said, he's thinking of nastier things, including the Graham sanctions. Now, for a Russian spokesman of the business community to say, we appreciate Trump for offering improved deals in business, investment, trade, and so forth. It's nonsense now, and Trump's making it nonsense.
John, do you believe that what Trump is trying to do is somehow a domestic policy to be translated? It doesn't have anything to do with what's going on in Ukraine. I don't see Donald Trump caring about Ukrainians the way that he's talking about it. It seems that something domestically is happening in the United States that's forcing Donald Trump to go in that direction. Where does it come from, in your opinion, if that's the case?
It's a good question, and it's important to understand that when we're talking, me as a Russian correspondent, and you in your position, to understand that politicians say things because domestic constituencies want to hear it. It makes votes, it makes support, and so forth. So to look at the Trump electoral calculation is something that we in this seat in the podcast ought to be doing. And it's regrettable that many podcasters from the United States who come on purport to be experts on Russia, experts on Iran, experts on the Arab world from Washington or wherever in the US they broadcast, but they aren't experts on their own country, on the United States. So let's look a bit at the domestic calculation. I think I've said it, and I can recommend folks go to realclearpolitics.com, and you'll see every day the accumulation of polls which are available to understand what American voters say is the direction of the country, positive or negative, whether they approve or disapprove President Trump's performance. And then that general question of approval rating is broken down by policy, inflation, immigration, foreign policy. Foreign policy is then divided in the polling surveys between Israel and Iran on the one hand, mainly, and then the Ukraine war on the other. And so it goes on. President Trump's domestic approval rating is negative. The gap is negative. A higher disapproval than approval just 6 months into his term. Now, not even Biden showed that. The crossover between approval of the president for Biden and disapproval came later, not so early as Trump is finding it. Second, the approval for fighting wars is the gap is smaller. Americans, and lots of them are listening to us now, and I'm one of them, find greater disapproval in what Trump has to say about the economy, about inflation, about preserving jobs and welfare and healthcare and education and so on. He knows that there's greater disapproval of what he has to say and his performance on domestic policies, just as you, Nima, emphasized it. So what he's doing is pitching where he thinks his base, his Republican Party base, believes he's strongest. And that's what the polls also show. You keep your base firm for as long as you can until you're right at the election day, and you hope to swing the let's say the undecided voters in each of the so-called battleground states to your side. And those voters include Black voters and Hispanic voters who've been drifting away in large numbers as Trump pitches his violence against Latin American immigrants, the so-called illegals, violence against Iran, the enemy of the Jews. Trump keeps saying it. His base loves to hear him being violent. And look at what he's done to pitch his image to them. He's had a huge military parade on the streets of Washington, D.C., the likes of which hasn't been seen since, I can't remember, certainly not in my lifetime, as a resident of Washington, D.C. That's more than 50 years. Second, he's had a flyover of the B-2 bombers that bombed Iran over the White House during the July 4th celebration. This display of military power, accompanied by the installation, as if the White House needed them, 2 more huge flagpoles. What is all this meaning? It means he's pitching at a domestic constituency that is as violent and foul-mouthed as he is. They love it. Now, can they re-elect him as president? Well, we'll see. It's a bit far off for that. But domestically, what he's doing is trying to divert attention from the domestic issues in which Americans, in their good and common sense, understand him to be lying and deceitful and fake. He, on the other hand, is pitching, I've won the war of Los Angeles against the protesters there. I'm winning the war against the judges and courts. I'm going to win the war against the Federal Reserve by forcing out the current chairman. I'm winning the war against Iran. And then all this nonsense about the Nobel Peace Prize, the so-called ceasefire he achieved between India and Pakistan. He says he achieved by threatening both of them with massive trade sanctions. This is a complete fabrication. We needn't go into it. It was Pakistan who applied for the ceasefire for help from Vice President Vance in order to stave off increasing escalation control over all of their air assets and their military assets on the Indian side. We discussed this before, and there's a consensus of all your podcasters that the so-called ceasefire between Iran and Israel was an urgent rescue for Israel, which was running out of ammunition. He thought that he's organized a ceasefire between the Congo and Rwanda. He simply assembled a ceremony with terms that are vague and yet to be implemented. He claims at that meeting with Netanyahu to have achieved a ceasefire or a peace between Serbia and Kosovo. That's the first time I've ever heard of that. And it goes on and on. The one resistance, it's a Christian resistance. He's got the Muslim Pakistan puts him up for Nobel Peace Prize in June. He asked Marshal Asim Munir to do that at the White House. It came 2 days later. He asked the Israelis to do it. Netanyahu presented him with a paper. Muslims and Jews put him up for Nobel Peace Prize winner. What about the Christians? Well, there's only one Christian I can think of, and that's President Vladimir Putin. And he's the one who resists this narrative of violence makes peace. It's rubbish, but Trump believes it. And as you indicated, he thinks he's got a domestic constituency which believes it.
John, 5 days ago we had the 4th of July, which is so much important in the history of the United States. And in those days, they went against the hegemony. They went against this sort of dominance of the British. And how the country that has been liberated from a hegemonic mind would become some sort of a would become a country that tries to dominate each and every part of the planet. Do you think that the United States since then has been transformed by the mindset of the British or by the mindset of those people came from Europe who has is that related to human nature? Is that related to the somehow to what came from the British somehow mindset to the United States, or we're gonna see a new 4th of July, a new movement in the United States that can liberate the United States from this sort of hegemony that they're trying to implement and they're trying to uh, dominate when it comes to the Asia, when it comes to Africa and Europe, all of this mindset. I think the main reason that the main engine that is running the show is this sort of they have to dominate everything. They have to decide about everything, even with the mindset that you mentioned about Iran, attacking with the negotiation with Russia. Donald Trump doesn't want to, as you mentioned, he doesn't want to negotiate. He wants to force his terms on Russia.
Yes.
This comes from a mindset in Washington. How do
Well,
you see that happening in Washington, that happening to the political system of the United States?
well, it's a big and profound question, and thank you for asking for it. I've been a U.S. citizen for more than half a century, and I came as an immigrant too, like generations before me. And I came to Massachusetts, let's call it the cradle of the American independence movement and the founding of the United States. In the first place, what one learns about the melting pot, the doctrine of multiculturalism, the doctrine, the founding doctrines of the United States as a welcome to the oppressed peoples of the world, is one that you encounter rather differently if you're an immigrant, no matter whether you come in at Harvard University's front gate or whether you come in the garment districts of Lower Manhattan or wherever, or the vegetable and fruit fields of California. What you need to understand about the creation of the United States is the class conflict that develops immediately. On the one hand, you have slavery in some regions. On the other hand, you have class conflict in other regions. And in one of the books I wrote many years ago, I think almost 50 years ago, was the history of the United States attempts to make drugs illegal. And first opium in California, which was a campaign against the Chinese underclass, as that underclass ceased to have the employment on the railroads, and opium or anti-opium became a rallying for the use of force against the underclass in California. A similar story can be told about marijuana. It can be told about heroin, and so forth. And I told that story in a book called Drugs and Minority Oppression. What podcasters you have like Michael Hudson show, and I agree with them, and what military podcasters like Colonel Wilkerson also show, is that as the US developed out of being an oppressed colonial society into a large power with imperial ambitions. It follows the imperial rules of the game. So to say it acquired imperial aspirations from the British isn't quite right, in the sense that imperial aspirations predate the British, predate the French Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire. Imperial mindset is how we should best describe it. And what you've just described is a combination, on the one hand, of imperial ambition to use force to compel vulnerable states or vulnerable continents like Africa, or the Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War, and so to compel their compliance with what the empire wants and needs. It's first. Second, inside the United States, you have a class conflict between those whose economic position is that of the victims of the imperial ambition at home, whose wage levels, whose welfare levels, whose longevity and death rates and so forth, whose living conditions are deprived and reduced in order to pay for the imperial ambition and profit of the ruling circles. Call them the power elite, as Wright Mills, the last decent professor from Chicago that I can remember. Wright Mills described it as the power elite. Others can refer to this phenomenon as the class conflict within the United States. But what we're seeing now is a Trump use of tricks to destroy the working organizations, the intellectual organizations of resistance to imperial ambition. Why? Not necessarily because they don't believe in the American exceptionalist doctrine, an ideology that even those who resist the empire's military expeditions share themselves. They want to be believed to be exceptionally intelligent, and they use podcasts and books to encourage everyone else in the world to accept their exceptionalism. And you know professors who are like that. Even those who share the exceptionalist mentality, when they resist the empire's current adventures, can be repressed. And Trump's doing it in his attacks on Harvard University, on Yale University, on all the so-called Ivy League upper class institutions that have trained the empire servants, the empire soldiers, the empire strategists for generations. For generations, those universities provided special rewards, the Ivy League in particular, special rewards for that elite to fight their wars. Now Trump is attacking them as if he's a socialist. Well, he's not. His attacks are fascist. They have a deceit covering an attempt to defraud the country and its budget, steal on $1 trillion scale, to use and apply force against domestic resistance and against foreign resistance. So you have a mindset, I wouldn't call it British, I'd call it imperial.
And we had BRICS Summit here in Brazil, John, and they were talking about the two attacks on Russia and Iran, and they were condemning the attacks. First of all, before getting into the details about what was that, what does that mean, and how do you see the attitude of BRICS changing and somehow talking about these things? It's something not that much common in the attitude of BRICS. The first time, or maybe the second time, they're talking about the geopolitical issues, the wars, and what's going on in terms of the conflict in Ukraine and the way that they attack Russia and they attack Iran. Your take on that?
Well, that's a big subject. let's take it piece by piece. First of all, we've had a predecessor of BRICS, the non-aligned movement, which represented independence from many of the same states, particularly India and China and the African states and some of the Latin American states, and Indonesia and some others. The non-aligned movement in the 1950s represented some of the ambition to find a peaceful basis for resisting colonialism, imperialism, to achieve the independence of the former colonial states of Africa, Asia, and so on. BRICS is something similar. I'm reaching over to get my papers, and it's different in other respects. It's different in several key respects. First of all, because it has major economic powerhouses, India, China, and Russia as leads, plus Brazil and South Africa. But the three global powerhouses are far more powerful, India, China, and Russia, than India and China were during the non-aligned movement period. So the economic clout, the economic influence is greater. Second, as you can see from this latest summit in Rio, BRICS is rapidly expanding its membership and its so-called associate membership or partnership of countries. So it's becoming larger and larger. What that does when it becomes larger is to create a pressure to find more common denominator issues on which you get general collective agreement and bury individual national disagreements. So here's, I'm poking it at you. For the audience, this is a 31-page, multi-thousand-word Rio Declaration, which the BRICS summit meeting, from which President Xi of China and President Putin of Russia were absent physically. President Putin made a video presentation. We'll come back to that in a minute. This is the declaration that the bureaucrats on the Brazil part cobbled together, and it represents an interesting but not a revolutionary document in trying to articulate what the consensus of this big group is. And that's where one shouldn't be dismissive, as the Western media have become. They would say the declaration is big but empty. It's not. They would say on key issues, the declaration slips its punches. For example, the word empire isn't there. The word colonialism is one of the declaration points raised by the African side in context of discussing reparations for the slave trade. The important points of finding common agreement are common denominator and important to emphasize. I'm looking at my notes because it's a big document, and remembering what's in there and what isn't in there is difficult. In the first place, to say about the Russian side, President Putin made an unusually brief few words in his video presentation, emphasizing how big and powerful, economically speaking, the BRICS group is now. He had very little to say in particular. Foreign Minister Lavrov gave a press briefing later, and that was much more informative on several issues. I'll highlight what Lavrov has said to indicate what the Russian position is, and then go back to your question generally. The emphasis Lavrov gave was very interesting to understand what Russia sought to achieve from this BRICS collective as a common denominator. In the first place, he said that the strong, and I'm quoting, strong emphasis was placed on reforming the United Nations. Predictably, the reform of the Security Council attracted the most attention. In other words, Russia is coming on board with the aspirations of Africa and Asia to be represented not only in the General Assembly, where they already are, but on the Security Council, where they're not. And to have an African seat on the Security Council has been the long-term ambition, particularly of Senegal, Nigeria, and South Africa. It's been rejected by the five, the veto-wielding five, but supported by Russia to some extent. What Lavrov said was, we favor the reform of the Security Council to increase the representation of the members of African states who are in BRICS, the Asian states, the American states like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Then he said, we focused on the reform of the UN Secretariat. That's a direct attack on Secretary General Guterres and all of the British and French and Germans surrounding him in the Secretariat, who really run the Security Council and tell Guterres what to say. Now, Guterres has been described, not politely, in Russia, in Moscow, as an enemy. He's continually supported Ukrainian operations. He's participated in bias. The Secretariat has worked against Russia on the Black Sea Grain Initiative and represented Ukrainian ambition and US ambition. The most recent objectionable bias of Guterres has been the behavior of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a UN and UN Secretariat controlled body, in the person of Rafael Graci, the IAEA chief. When Iran says, IAEA, get out, you've been spying against us and providing target information to the United States and Israel, they're speaking the truth. On the other hand, Russia's trying to find a way to reform the Guterres setup, accused it explicitly of being British, American, German, and French controlled. That's got to change, he said. And second, he wants to emphasize the Russian readiness to reintegrate IAEA in a peace deal for Iran, such that Russia could assist in the entire and controversial issue of what's to be done with the enriched uranium Iran produces, needs to produce, which Trump has just tried to say he has obliterated when he hasn't. So on the reform of the UN as a central organization, Russia has tried to say, we support the consensus. Guterres has got to go. The Anglo-American control of the Secretary of the United Nations Security Council has got to go. Second, on de-dollarization, a lot of podcasters and a lot of words are written, some by your guests and our colleagues, to exaggerate what the Russian position is on de-dollarization. What comes out of this 31-page declaration is a commitment of BRICS not to replace the dollar, but to find substitute payment systems in national currencies that can resist the illegal use of the dollar as a weapon. And you've had my friend and colleague, Paul Craig Roberts, talk about the weaponization of the dollar, bringing the dollar down as BRICS and others resist. Now, it's not the case that this BRICS summit agreed on a BRICS currency. That's been advertised and therefore exaggerated, and therefore, since it wasn't adopted in the declaration, dismissed as a failure. It's not. What Lavrov has said as the Russian position is the common position of BRICS: gradual and steady improvement of payment systems between the BRICS states in national currencies, and the holding of reserves in their national currencies, not in the US dollar, not in the US Treasury security, and not in the euro. Lavrov adds the euro, not de-dollarization, de-euroization as well. And that's important. I mean, this is a small step on a long path to the resistance and replacement of the imperial powers, the United States, Britain, France, and Germany. And these are big achievements if you put together such a big group of countries. Now, I'm just looking through my papers, so pardon me for averting my eyes while I try to make sense of the 31 pages. There's no, what you might call, Marxist orientation. There's no anti-imperialist language. Empire doesn't appear. Colony only once in relation to African slave trade. So there's what I would call a surprising endorsement of the role of the IMF. Surprising endorsement of the role of the World Bank. These are institutions that dominate the aid receiving countries of the world, the developing countries of the world, the global South. After Russia's experience with the IMF as a US-controlled organization, it's surprising to find Russia supporting any further future for the IMF in its current form. On that executive board of directors, the US dominates. There's very little point in this declaration to call on the IMF executive board to do anything else but what the US wants. So to say otherwise of the IMF or the World Bank is to spit in the wind. It's pointless, especially after the IMF at US direction and the World Bank at US direction have been pumping money into the Ukraine war to fight Russia. Done corruptly, yes. Spent years reporting how the IMF and its office in Kiev supplied the Ukrainian oligarchs with cash and war-fighting material. So it's surprising to see this declaration endorse such bodies. You can't reform them because you can't remove the United States shareholding control. You have on the Israeli genocide in Gaza no use of the word genocide. That's missing. Instead, you get language like this: we strongly condemn all violations of international humanitarian law, including deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, including civilian infrastructure, as well as the denial or obstruction of humanitarian access and the targeting of humanitarian personnel. That's an obvious reference to Gaza. Why hide it? Answer: you've got serious differences within the BRICS community of how hard to go against Israel. And that hasn't been resolved. For example, you have Egypt now in the BRICS fold, and you have language which is essentially an endorsement of Palestine under the Palestine Authority. That's an attack on Hamas. And it would be useful for your Arab colleagues and Iranian colleagues to note that Iran, as a member, and Egypt as a member, signed this declaration of endorsement for the Palestine Authority, which is a political option that's there, but is not quite up to date, you might say, to speak politely. On India and Pakistan, you had you had a particular reference which the Indian side put in to condemn in the strongest terms the terrorist attack in Jammu and Kashmir on 22 April 2025, during which 26 people were killed and many more injured. So you've got an attempt to downplay war in a way that can be acceptable to all signatories and keep the collective together. You have an endorsement, you have a clear condemnation of the US attack on Iran. Quotes, "We condemn the military strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran since 13 June, which constitute a violation of international law and the Charter of the United Nations, and expressed grave concern over the subsequent escalation of the security situation in the Middle East. We further express serious concern over deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure and peaceful nuclear facilities under full safeguards of the IAEA, blah, blah, blah." So I'm trying to answer your question by looking at the small print. Unless we look at the small print, we can't understand what an achievement, and let's not dismiss it, it is to get more than a dozen countries with serious internal difficulties domestically and between themselves to come to an accord like this. And that's an achievement. At the same time, the positive side is to find ways of effectively resisting Trump's weaponization of the dollar, as Paul Craig Roberts explained a few hours ago on your podcast, Nima. And you have, let's call it, some liberal economic philosophy in endorsing not only the IMF and the World Bank, but the G20, which is also endorsed. We, and I'm quoting, "We underscored the key role of the G20 as the premier global forum for international economic cooperation." Well, why say that? Why say it at all? Why not just say, we, the BRICS, maintain these positions? Why endorse anybody else? I find it odd that the BRICS declaration endorses IMF, World Bank, and G20 when it didn't have to. And I have no idea, because I wasn't there, and I'm not familiar with the internal politicking, which countries of the BRICS pushed IMF, World Bank, and G20. I don't know. It's not, I believe, Russia, because there's no reference to these points in Lavrov's summary, and Putin's speech was much too short and ambiguous and vague to convey anything like that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry for the audience who wanted to see Ray McGovern on. Hopefully he'll be here next week and will tell us all that he learned about the Germans. But for the time being, thank you for having me. And I hope that our audience will understand that we are closing in on the Oreshnik moment. When the President of the United States swears at the President of Russia, you've passed the point of being able to negotiate. So when words fail, force rules.
See you soon, John. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.